Welcome back to the most accurate podcast here at 4 for 4 Football. As always, I'm your host, John Daigle, for this Week 13 preview show, joined by the man himself, friend in life, and the individual who ate his wife's cranberry sauce because he has a happy marriage, John Paulsen. Paulsen, how's it going, buddy?
That's a nice callback from last week.
Yeah.
The Thanksgiving, or the 2 weeks ago, the Thanksgiving show. I guess it was last week. So, doing pretty well. Week 13. Getting towards the end of the season. I'm looking forward to some time off, but we got some fantasy playoffs to win, and we still have 4 to 5 weeks to go.
You are not kidding about the time off. Also, you weren't aware of this, but my favorite, I'm trying to think right now, but yes, my favorite line of comedy and humor is the callback. Callbacks are always great because it also shows the other person you listen. Sam Hoppen, director of analytics. I also listen to you, but you're just out running in the snow, so nothing really to discuss.
I'm not running in the snow. I signed up for an in-person gym for the first time since COVID started, and have been back there a couple times this week, avoiding the now blistering cold in Chicago.
Good for you. Happy to see you making those strides, getting back into a normal routine. But like both of you, I was excited for time off. I thought it was smooth sailing being week 13 the rest of the way. But then we have a plethora of fallouts to discuss here. And let's start with Travis Etienne, who Coach Doug Peterson did say is day-to-day, said he, quote-unquote, feels good about Etienne's chances of playing, but also said they weren't going to rush him back. And so if Etienne is active, I would think he's 100% good to go. Otherwise, I would expect JaMycal Hasty and, of course, Darrell Henderson hanging around here after they picked him up off waivers from the Rams to make his debut. Paulsen, let's assume Etienne plays given his current status. What do you feel about Etienne and Hasty in Week 13 and the second highest total of the week against the Lions?
Yeah, this is definitely a game to target for DFS and fantasy owners or fantasy managers. I did downgrade Etienne's distributions a little bit this week, thinking that if they do play him, that they won't necessarily give him the every down type role that they have been giving him, and maybe take, Hasty's played pretty well, especially in the passing game. They do have Henderson now in the mix, so who knows? But the thing that led me to believe that he's going to play is that they said that he could have returned to the game, but they decided to hold him out last week after the injury. So we'll see. We'll see what he does this week. And I think if he does play, he's a high-end RB2, low-end RB1. If he's out, then you're probably looking at Hasty in another big role, and it just depends on how quickly they want to get Darrell Henderson involved in the offense. I think he was a nice pickup for them, giving them some depth at running back, given the James Robinson trade.
And Hasty did outtouch Snoop Connor 17-3 to close the game. So we would think that if Henderson falls into that same role as Connor, it's then useless. But at the same time, maybe they want to see more of what they have in Henderson and him being a fresh body on the roster, Sam. So how do you think this plays out if, let's say, Etienne were surprisingly scratched in this game?
Yeah, I'm not going to lie. I totally forgot about Darrell Henderson being picked up by the Jaguars. So I was all ready to, pump up JaMycal Hasty here. He played on 78% of the team snaps, was basically the workhorse besides Etienne. And so it's, with this situation and a lot of the situations we're going to talk about, where we have a guy, Darrell Henderson, in this scenario where he didn't play last week, but is expected to play this week, and it's just going to muddle everything. So I think if Etienne is out, I would lean Hasty over Henderson, given, again, the fact that Hasty has been with the team this entire year. He made some really great catches. He had that nice touchdown, better throw from Lawrence, but a nice receiving touchdown there, had 12 carries, wasn't particularly efficient, only had 2.3 yards per carry on those 12 carries. But I think in the matchup against the Detroit Lions, I think Hasty or Henderson could be, again, to Paulsen's point, sneaky starts for DFS.
And Hasty, 5.5 yards per touch off that bench. That amazing wheel route for that receiving touchdown from Trevor Lawrence as well. An incredible start for sure if Etienne is ruled out here. Another backfield we need to discuss is the Jets, because Michael Carter, DNP on Wednesday, listed day-to-day with his ankle injury. But more importantly, Robert Saleh said not only has Zonovan White earned a role moving forward regardless of Carter's status, but he said the running back rotation is a quote-unquote week-to-week thing, and that includes James Robinson, who was healthy scratched in favor of Zonovan White this past game. So Paulsen, after we saw Carter out-touch Zonovan White 8-5 in the first half in a timeshare, and then Knight out-touched Ty Johnson 12-5 in the second half once Carter was injured. What are we speculating with this backfield? And let's assume that Carter is out for week 13.
Yeah, if he's out, I think the pecking order right now appears to be Knight, Johnson, and then Robinson. I do think that Robinson could get another look. We've seen him as a feature back. The Jets know that he can be a feature back, but it does appear like they want to get Knight involved. He did pretty well last week, 14 carries, 69 yards. He had 3 catches for 34 yards. So a big yardage game for him against a very bad Bears defense. So if Carter's out, I would, and I have ranked them in that order: Knight, Johnson, and Robinson. But it wouldn't be shocking for, Robinson to not. I mean, I don't think he'd be the lead back over Knight, given what they did with Knight last week. But he might, take over for Ty Johnson. But Ty Johnson had 5 carries for 62 yards and a touchdown. He looked good as well. So really no reason to force Robinson back up the depth chart if they viewed him as a healthy scratch last week. It might take him a few weeks if Carter's out a while for him to try to get any sort of role in that backfield.
And Mike White throwing to this backfield collectively for the second highest target share on the team. Garrett Wilson, 28.5% of the team's targets. The running backs combined, 25%. Any thoughts on this backfield or Garrett Wilson overall, Sam, moving forward? Mike White, of course, who also over this next month of the season seems like a fringe QB1 starter in QB2 leagues, given that the Jets will now close out, this week against the Vikings, but also the Bills, the Lions, and the Jaguars in their next 4 games as well.
Yeah, so going back to the backfield, I would not really be interested in Ty Johnson. 5 of his 8 opportunities, or 7 opportunities, came when New York had a 14-plus point lead in the second half against the Bears. Again, a terrible defense overall. So I would put the pecking order as Knight, Robinson, Johnson, just because I believe in Robinson's talent a little bit more than Ty Johnson, who I think is sort of just a guy at this point. But all of these, not all of, but the running back position for the Jets will continue to have a lot of value because of what you pointed out with the target share that Mike White has for the running back position. Garrett Wilson looks like a star. They play the Vikings this week, who should be able to put up some points against what has been a really good Jets defense. So I think it's starting to be clear that, again, Mike White is targeting the 2 best receivers on this team in Wilson and Elijah Moore, who got his first touchdown of the year this past week as well. So I'm pretty bullish on this Jets offense with Mike White under center, even if they, for some reason, go to Joe Flacco. As long as it's not Zach Wilson, I think there is upside for a lot of these Jets players.
NFL Network's Ian Rappaport reported that Najee Harris did not suffer a serious abdomen injury on Monday night, fortunately, but his status for week 13 is up in the air. Jaylen Warren, of course, also dealing with that soft tissue hamstring injury. And although Mike Tomlin, Paulsen, said it's not anything that he's worried about, Warren also didn't practice at any point last week, including Saturday ahead of Monday night. So I do worry about his status ahead of week 13, and that's important since the Falcons are allowing the 9th most schedule-adjusted fantasy points to enemy backfields. So let's assume, knowing that we aren't sure of Warren's status, we think Harris will miss this game. How would you handle Snell and Anthony McFarland in that situation?
Yeah, I definitely think that Warren is ahead of those 2 if he's healthy, but
Absolutely.
we don't know if he's healthy. Benny Snell's first 12 carries came last week. Anthony McFarland's first 6 carries came last week, whereas Warren's been playing behind Harris this entire time. So just a question of his health. If he's healthy or if he's able to play, I probably would rank him as sort of a dicey RB2, RB3, just because of the hamstring. We just don't know how they're gonna approach his workload if he were the lead back. If Warren is out, we saw Snell with 13 touches last week, McFarland with 8, and I think we'll probably see some kind of running back by committee between those two. Snell's efficiency was pretty good, 62 yards in those 12 carries. McFarland was good too, 30 yards on 6 carries. So probably a rotation between those two. They don't love either of those players, but they know they can turn to them in a pinch if both Harris and Warren are out.
Sam, any thoughts on the Steelers wide receiver situation? Because we are seeing Kenny Pickett continue to lower the bar weekly and having the lowest completion rate on throws 10+ yards downfield since he took over as starter.
The receivers, George Pickens looks like the real deal at this point. He's made a spectacular catch almost each week, it looks like, and he's got a much further downfield average depth of target. So the lack of accuracy downfield from Pickett is a little bit concerning, but I do think it's that Johnson and Pickens are both flex options at this point. The Steelers are still passing the ball quite a bit from a pass rate over expectation standpoint. So I do think that those two and Pat Freiermuth, who didn't have a great game this past week against the Colts, do hold some value, even though Pickett hasn't been phenomenal as a quarterback.
Yeah, and I think you look at Pickett, he's the problem. You've got, I see a lot of Deontay Johnson slander because he's getting tons of targets and not
including from me
a whole lot. But I mean, you're looking at a quarterback who's thrown for 3 touchdowns in 8 games, 8 interceptions, 6 yards per attempt. He's got a pretty nice rapport, or decent, or at least a better rapport with George Pickens than he does with Deontay Johnson. But Deontay Johnson gets open at will. We know this over the years that he's continuously performed very well in Matt Harmon's charting over reception perception. His open score, I believe that's at ESPN Next Gen Stats, is excellent. He gets open at will, but he doesn't have any sort of rapport with Pickett, and Pickett can't deliver the ball to him at all. And then you got 3 touchdowns. So with that sort of low scoring offense, passing offense, both these guys are going to be dicey, but Pickens is at least able to make these contested catches, which is important when you have Pickett throwing the ball.
Deontay Johnson, the wide receiver 54 in points per game this year, which I am not saying that's his fault. That's his problem. I do blame that on Kenny Pickett, but at the same time, it's our problem if we start him, which I do not care about his targets. So still a concern for me moving forward. On Josh Jacobs, though, Paulsen, I do believe he plays, but the report right now from NFL Network's Mike Garafolo is that Jacobs is simply hoping to play after he was seriously injured in practice on Friday ahead of Sunday, and then, of course, rolled out for 39 touches, 50 fantasy points, and overall RB1 week. Let's pretend as if Jacobs is out, because if Jacobs starts, he's RB1 in your rankings, and rightfully so, in this spot against the Chargers. But if Jacobs is out, what we've seen so far is Amir Abdullah and Brandon Bolden not handle more than 3 carries, either of them, in any game this year. So you would assume, even though they've been active for more games than Zamir White, you would assume White profiles as the early down goal line bruiser in place of Jacobs. But I'm curious to get your thoughts on that backfield sans Jacobs.
Yeah, I just want to underline the fact that Jacobs played through that calf injury, and that's one of the worst injuries for a running back to play through, according to Adam Hutchinson's numbers. 20-30% drop in production first came back from a calf injury. So really impressive performance for Josh Jacobs. And, he finished the game, so I would assume he would play this week. But if he doesn't, I do agree. I mean, you're looking at the last 4 weeks, RBBC report for the Raiders. Zamir White has 5 carries for 26 yards. Amir Abdullah has 3 catches for 16 yards and 11 catches for 85 yards. So we probably see, no catches for Zamir White. So what you probably see is White in that early down ball carrying type role. getting most of the carries with Abdullah rotating in as the passing down back. I don't think they want to turn to Brandon Bolden as their lead back. So I think you do see a White Abdullah combination there if Jacobs has to sit.
FFPC League free agency still open for the next 2 weeks, Hoppen. And I know you and I both snuck teams into the playoffs with Connor. Paulsen, I'm not sure if your team with your friends got in. You can update us on that or ignore my question if it didn't move through. But what are you doing with this Raiders backfield, knowing that Jacobs is questionable and Abdullah and Bolden at least are available on most wires, maybe White on some as well?
I do think at this point they're all worth an ad. If you're in the playoffs for FFPC leagues, I have to imagine your running back position is pretty solidified at this point. So I would very much struggle to plug any of them into a starting lineup if Jacobs was out, because I do think they, again, distribute the workload quite a bit if he doesn't play. But again, certainly, any running backs that are available on the wire are worth adding at this point. I think I would probably lean Abdullah over the rest of them just because he's been involved in the passing game this year. But it's really not a pretty picture outside of Josh Jacobs in that backfield.
Let's get to the big one, which is touch and go. Because Elijah Mitchell, yes, out of the way. 6 to 8 weeks, maybe returns in the actual NFL postseason, but now easily droppable fantasy. But Christian McCaffrey reportedly suffered a knee irritation on Monday and looking like he's day-to-day, and the worst news for us, reading the tea leaves, probably limited and questionable throughout the week, even at practice. Having said that, Tyrion Davis-Price, healthy scratch for the past couple of games, I would guess because he doesn't play special teams, and Jordan Mason does. That's why Jordan Mason then received a season-high 5 carries this past week whenever both CMC and Mitchell were unavailable because they were both injured. But Paulsen, 49ers beat reporters also believe we're going to see Tevin Coleman promoted from the practice squad. Tevin Coleman, of course, who was the RB9 in week 5, which seems like a long time ago, but does have that under his belt under Kyle Shanahan this year. What are your thoughts on this situation, whether McCaffrey plays or not? So we may have to have 2 discussions here.
I think you underlined that situation with Mason and Davis-Price pretty well. Mason plays a lot on special teams. Davis-Price does play on special teams. You say he didn't, but he does a little bit. 5 snaps in week 6, 8 in week 7, but I don't think that they view him as, their special teams running back like they do Mason. So sometimes we see that where the third back, stumbles into some carries because of an injury to the second back, and maybe the first back's dinged up in the situation McCaffrey, and Mason ended up with some touches. And then the following week when that, Elijah Mitchell, the RB2 is out, another guy gets promoted. It could be Coleman, it could be Davis-Price, and they end up leapfrogging the special teams back. We see this quite often. So we'll have to keep an eye on the inactives in terms of who they decide to promote and have. If they have Coleman, it does seem like there's a level of trust there that Shanahan has with him that he doesn't maybe have with these younger backs. I probably would view Coleman as the RB2 behind McCaffrey if McCaffrey's able to play. And then if it's Davis-Price, that does also indicate some trust in him. But I would say it's kind of a coin flip as to whether or not he or Mason get the work. Mason was actually pretty good last week. I think 46 yards on 10 carries. Davis-Price has 16 carries for 37 yards on the season. So, yards per carry is not the greatest metric in the world, but it's, coaches do pay attention to it. So, Mason ran pretty well last week. He might get the nod over Davis-Price. But as you mentioned, Coleman is kind of the wild card there.
And TDP Mason 14-0 in week 2 before he suffered that high ankle sprain. And then also when he returned from that ankle sprain, out-touched Tevin Coleman 7-0 in week 7. Jordan Mason healthy scratched in that game since Tevin Coleman also plays special teams. Pretty important for the third back, whoever's active for the 49ers under Kyle Shanahan his entire coaching career. Sam, I've looked at the waivers yet again on FFPC main events. SFBX playoffs also heading into the second round, I believe, this week. All these guys, TDP, Tevin Coleman, they're out there. I have some massive bids on some. So how are you handling these players in free agency in these deeper 10-man bench leagues?
So I do think I'd rather have a piece of this 49ers backfield than the Raiders backfield that we just talked about, because the offense is just better. Paulsen mentioned that Mason had 10 carries last week. He has 10 carries this year. He had 5 last week and had 25 yards, averaged 1.18 rushing yards over expectation per carry, which is pretty good. Again, a very small sample, but got a touch on over half of the snaps that he played. So I think that Mason is probably where I would lean as number 1, and then Coleman 2 with Davis Price 3. Again, like Tevin Coleman is just sort of around at this point. Like it's crazy that he's still plugging and chugging with the 49ers, but it's a situation. Again, they play the Dolphins this week, who should be able to put points up against them. So it's not like it'll be, I don't think, an overly positive game script for the 49ers in what I am trademarking the Shanahan scheme showdown. But it'll be, I think, interesting to see how these touches get distributed if McCaffrey is out.
So we all came to a different conclusion. Helps no one. Great. Paulsen, let's talk about Deshaun Watson making his debut against this JV Texans team. But it is Watson's first game. He did perform poorly in the preseason. What are we expecting here for his debut?
Yeah, I'm having trouble ranking him this week, just level of confidence. But, when he's been starting and active and in a normal season, he's a top 5 fantasy quarterback. So I think this is going to be I tweeted, like, I just realized that this was his first game is at Houston. It's wild. I don't know if the NFL planned this or what, but
oh, buddy, when it's an 11-game suspension, not a 10-game suspension, they planned this. This is all about the money.
It's wild. He averaged 301 yards, 2.1 touchdowns per game in 2020. He's never averaged less than 257, 1.6 touchdowns in the last 3 seasons. The interesting thing here is the matchup is that the Texans have been like weirdly stingy against the pass. They've only given up 10 pass touchdowns, but they have been giving up 6 most yards per attempt, 7.6. So there's some opportunity here, but they tend to be low scoring games with Houston. And I think managers that are looking at him as a starter, like would best be served waiting a week to see how he does in his first game back. There's going to be a lot of drama and emotion surrounding this game. I don't know that he comes out and tears it up. The Houston Texans are bad against the run. The Browns could just, hand it off 30, 40 times to Nick Chubb and Kareem Hunt and win the game and kind of ease Watson back into the mix and not ask him to do too much in his first game back. On the other hand, he does have a lot more talent than some of these other QB2s that we're perhaps looking at to stream this week. So, he's dicey, but talented.
Well, completely agree. I want him to go off of my bench. I don't trust him in my starting lineup in his first game back, especially because waiver wires out there. I know Trevor Lawrence, Jared Goff, even Mike White, and perhaps Aaron Rodgers or Jordan Love are out there. And I think I'd start all over Deshaun Watson this week. But Sam, speaking of their pass catchers, I know there is hype for them to be elevated from Watson, but at the same time, like, I don't know how much more meat is on the bone. Amari Cooper's the wide receiver 13 in fantasy points per game. Donovan Peoples-Jones is the wide receiver 43. David Njoku's the tight end 7. So, like, what else are we expecting from Watson?
That's a really good question. I mean, I struggle with that too. I think if this week we see Deshaun Watson play like he has played in the past, it could elevate someone, I think, like Donovan Peoples-Jones up to a potentially high-end wide receiver 3. You're going to keep starting Amari Cooper. You're going to keep starting David Njoku while he's healthy. But I think the other thing that I'll be paying close attention to, and it'll be tough to distinguish in this game if it goes a way that Cleveland gets out to a big lead, is do they change their pass rush splits with Watson versus the quarterbacks that they've had over the past several years? They have notoriously been a run first offense, and rightfully so. They have one of, if not the best backfield in the entire league, and haven't had quarterbacks that can necessarily push the ball downfield or push it downfield well. And so if they're in neutral game scripts, are they going to lean on Watson? I think for this game, they probably don't, and they probably won't have to. But that's the other thing holding these Browns pass catchers back, is the fact that they have continued to lean on the run and be a run first team.
I could just add to that. You outlined it well, John, that they've really performed well given what we kind of thought from Amari Cooper and Peoples-Jones and Njoku. But the Browns are just 17th in passing yards on the year. They're 23rd in passing touchdowns on the year. Brissett averages like 7.1 yards per attempt. And Deshaun Watson has a career 8.3 yards per attempt. So I think there is actually some upside here. I think the question is after a year off and all this drama, how does he play? Is he still the same Deshaun Watson that we've seen in his career, or does it take him the rest of the season to sort of get back to that sort of form?
Leading the league in passing yards without DeAndre Hopkins, and for 2 months without Will Fuller, the last time we saw him, it doesn't carry much weight, to your point, because that was also a year and a half ago. So what happens then, which is why you and I are both on the same side and just waiting to see, at least in this first game, how it plays out. On the other side of the ball, though, in this particular matchup, Paulsen, Dameon Pierce, 20 touches the last 2 games, 1.6 yards per touch, and no hope. But Rex Burkhead in concussion protocol, and also we know this Browns defense has leaked a top 5 rate of 10-plus yard runs to opposing backfields. So you would think, on paper at least, it's a great spot to get back on Pierce. Where are you ranking him in Week 13?
I still have him ranked as sort of a low-end RB2. I mean, he was flirting with those, RB1 rankings when he was going through his good midseason stretch there. I mean, he had a really nice stretch. But then last 2 weeks, Washington, 10 carries, 8 yards. Miami, 5 carries, 8 yards. And Miami wasn't like a bad matchup either. It just, Miami tends to jump out to leads and teams don't run against them as much. They're 16th in adjusted fantasy points allowed to running backs. But to your point, the Browns are 32nd, last in the league in adjusted fantasy points allowed to running backs. This has to be a get-right game for Pierce. I think my one concern is that his snaps dropped to 56% last week against Miami. They weren't using him as much. But if they want to win this game, which I assume they do since it's against Deshaun Watson, they really need to run the ball, keep that Cleveland offense off the field as much as possible, and work their advantage, which is their theoretically strong running game, at least with a good running back, against the league's worst, or one of the league's worst rush defenses.
Sam, I actually want to change it up and come to you about the Bucs backfield, because we are waiting out this Leonard Fournette news. And what we saw was Rachaad White did get there, especially in half PPR leagues, with his 9 catches last week. Still performed poorly as a rusher on the ground. But at the same time, we have to ask, was it enough to hold off Fournette in the passing game if Leonard comes back this week? So what are your thoughts on Rachaad White if Fournette is active? Because we don't need to ask the question about Rachaad White if Fournette's out. We just started.
I would struggle to start Rachaad White if Fournette is active. I don't think that White did enough to truly separate himself. He was terribly inefficient against, again, the Browns defense that we just talked about, which is the worst rushing defense in the league. Again, he got the passing work, which is huge and what helped make his day valuable for fantasy. But it's not a situation where I think if Fournette is active, they're just going to hand the tides over to White. So I'd probably be sitting him if Fournette was active. If at best, I think is a flex option. But they do play the Saints, who have always played the Bucs tough in the last couple years, while Brady has been on the team. The tough part is that this game is Monday night, so there's a chance you don't find out about Fournette until Monday. So I don't know. Monitor the practice reports. Obviously, I think if signs are trending towards Fournette playing, I would be a little bit more conservative and start someone else over White.
How would you handle Fournette in that game if he plays, Paulsen?
Well, I just want to comment on White. I mean, you look at what he did the last 2 weeks against Seattle, 22 carries, 105 yards. You guys made it sound like he didn't do much against Cleveland in the running game, but looking at his game log, 14 carries for 64 yards, 4.6 yards per carry. Didn't score a touchdown, which I think is the issue, but he had 109 total yards. This Bucs offense has been so bad in the running game that the fact that he has back-to-back weeks averaged 4.57 yards per carry or more, I think, and he's also started both the games. And we forget that he started that game in London, or was it Germany, against Seattle. So he's got back-to-back starts. It looks like they're shifting away from Fournette. So the way I would treat it if Fournette's back, to answer your question, is I still would have, I mean, obviously White's going to drop from the like mid-range RB2 level down to RB2, RB3 with Fournette active. But I don't think Fournette comes back and has a big, lead back type workload, given the way that Rachaad White has performed over the last couple of weeks.
And in the first half of that game in Munich, before Fournette got injured, reminder, he out-touched Rachaad White 14-10, had 14-10, yes. And then we also know White hasn't out-targeted Fournette in any game this year. So I lean your way as well, that it's most likely a timeshare. Also, you added that caveat, the Bucs offense has been bad in the running game. You could have just stopped after bad. Just cut it off and just say, yes, Bucs bad everything. For Jamar Chase, though, rumors are he's going to return this year. He said as much, or this week. He said as much. Zach Taylor seems to have said as much. Joe Burrow believes he's returning. Beat reporters believe he's returning. I'll still believe it when I see it. But at the same time, Paulsen, let's assume he's back. We don't know if he would be limited in his first game back. And what is the highest total of the week? 53 points. How are you handling Chase in his first game from injury?
Well, if he's active, you start him. The last time he played Kansas City, he had 11, or at least the regular season, 11 catches, 266 yards, 3 touchdowns on 12 targets. Maybe he plays 60, 70% of the snaps instead of 90% of the snaps, but he can certainly still get there in that sort of workload. I feel like he's one of those guys that he's that talented that if he's active, you pretty much have to start him unless they're saying he's going to have a very, very limited role.
Sam, T. Higgins popping up these past 2 games as a top 12 wide receiver without Jamar Chase, as Higgins is clearly at full health. So how would you move T. Higgins down or up or alongside Chase if Chase is active here?
I mean, for this week specifically, I'd keep Higgins right where he is, maybe bump him down 1 or 2 spots, but this game is expected to be a shootout. The Bengals are passing the ball at one of the highest rates in the league, which is great to see. They're going to have to do that against the Chiefs. Higgins has been, he scored 4 touchdowns this year, I think is a good red zone threat for them as well. And so it's a situation where, again, we don't know right now what Chase's availability is going to be, even if he is active. And so, I mean, if you have Higgins, you're starting him. I think Tyler Boyd is probably the one guy who people are more on the fence with. But in this game specifically, I'd still be starting Tyler Boyd as at least a flex option, because I think he actually has played a little bit better with Chase in the lineup, because defenses are taking attention away from guys like Boyd and putting it on Jamar Chase. So all 3 of these wide receivers, I think, have tremendous upside, especially this week.
Any thoughts on Tyler Boyd, Paulsen? Because yes, I agree, a flex option just given the matchup, but I don't have any like analytics as to why he's basically disappeared off the face of the earth the past few games.
No, and he's good enough to perform in as our wide receiver 2 to Higgins. Really disappointing, really. You look at the last 2 games, 2 for 42 against Pittsburgh on 7 targets, 2 for 16 on 4 targets against Tennessee. I know he missed a few snaps, came out. They looked at him, evaluated him for a concussion, I think, in that Tennessee game last week. So, he has a tendency to just pop his head up every once in a while. 4 for 105 and a touchdown against the Jets in week 3, 8 for 155 and a touchdown against Atlanta, but otherwise not clearing 70 yards all year. He's more of a dart throw wide receiver 3, wide receiver 4 type for me if Chase is back. I mean, I think the thing you can say, if Chase is out, then there's targets up for grabs, and they're not really throwing to the other receivers a whole lot. So Boyd should see a higher floor, but we really haven't seen that the last couple of weeks.
And Boyd will definitely get played at least in DFS this week, even if Chase is back, because we're all sick puppies. Mike Evans has not finished inside the top 35 receivers in 3 consecutive games. And whether you watch the film and see these prayer yards that are thrown over his head as uncatchable throws, whether you look at the stats and 18 quarterbacks having that made 50 pass attempts, 10 plus yards downfield this year, Brady's has the 4th lowest completion rate of all of them on those throws and the lowest touchdown rate on those throws as well this year. You could just argue that Evans and this offense are just a product of one another and being bad. So are you worried about Mike Evans, Paulsen, moving forward as Godwin continues soaking up the higher target share here?
Yeah, I mean, watching the Bucs last week, it just seems like Brady and Godwin have a better rapport right now than Brady and Evans. But I mean, Evans is going to score some touchdowns here at some point, and it's just inevitable. It's just, when is it going to happen? He's been popping in our breakout receiver model for several weeks, but it hasn't happened. But as you mentioned, it's more prayer yards right now than air yards. Tom Brady is 27th in adjusted completion percentage over at PFF. So, he's there with Russell Wilson and below Mitch Trubisky at 27. So not a whole lot of optimism, other than the fact that you're thinking at some point that these two, who have really performed well together over the last couple of years, can get on the same page and get it going. And you think that, they would eventually score. They are scoring some touchdowns now, just haven't gone to Evans.
Anything you're seeing from the Bucs passing game, Sam?
So the other thing to note here with Mike Evans is they play the Saints, and they have Marshawn Lattimore has notably shut down Mike Evans quite a bit, but Lattimore has not played since week 5. And if you'll recall, both were ejected in the game back in week 2, with Evans getting suspended the following week. So I would not, that said, I would not shy away from starting Mike Evans just if Lattimore does return this week. I think that's a little bit overhyped at this point, but it's nice to see Chris Godwin actually find the end zone recently, because he had been similar to Deontay Johnson with having a ton of targets but 0 touchdowns. So I think Godwin and Evans, you continue to start the tight end position for Tampa Bay has become muddier and muddier. So I'm not starting either of them. And the Bucs have continued to pass the ball less than expected, which is much different than what they've been the past several years.
Brayton Otten, to your point, sharing routes run, and thus, like every other tight end behind Travis Kelce, spin a wheel and pick one. Doesn't matter at all. Sam, I have on my notes that you want to talk about the Falcons running backs, and my question is why. So please, let's see the charts, and let's discuss some Atlanta backfield fallout.
Look, I want to talk about the Falcons backfield, but at least I don't want to talk about any tight ends, which you have noted several times is a very bleak and desperate position in fantasy football. But I saw a question in the chat of whether someone should drop Cordell Patterson for J.K. Dobbins. I don't think that's the right way to go. I do think Patterson at this point is probably the only Falcons player worth starting when he returned it looked like there might be some room for Tyler Algier, but Algier played 38.6% of the team snaps, which is his lowest since week 3. But Patterson's snap share has gone up each of the last 3 weeks. He was up to 57.9% this past week, and I think with 6 high value touches, that was his season high as well. It's interesting with how much the Falcons run the ball that they rank 4th lowest in high value touches per game given to the running back position. That's obviously a lot of that is because they're not passing the ball to their running backs, but also not necessarily giving it to them when they get in closer or not getting into the red zone that often. So I think at this point, Patterson, you can still probably start. He has, as we've seen, the ability to fall into the end zone a couple times in a given week. But outside of that, Algier and Caleb Huntley are at best bench stashes.
Damian Williams, of course, also expected back in the next couple of games, even though I feel like I've been saying that for the last couple of games. Yeah.
Can I just mention that, Patterson's a player that we wonder why he doesn't get more targets for a bad receiving core that the Falcons have. He did see 5 targets last week with Kyle Pitts out, so that was his most since week 1. It was more than he had. It was more than he had in the 3 previous games, which was 4. So there is a little bit of upside there as a receiver for him. He had 14 touches, and it does look like that Thursday game against Carolina in week 10 was a blip. Like they were purposefully limiting his workload in that game coming off of the injury and a pretty big workload in week 9. And they've come back to him 12 touches and 14 touches the last 2 weeks.
You don't see anything from Drake London as well, right, Paulsen? 16% target share this past game. They literally, was always my concern, is that just like Pitts, they don't move the needle for their skill players. Like Arthur Smith calls his offense, he doesn't cater to his personnel, and so nothing changed in this first game, at least with Pitts on IR this past week.
Yeah, and it was really Zacchaeus that had the good game. So you're hoping that. You're hoping with Pitts out that he's going to come in and London's going to come in and all of a sudden see 10 targets, but he only saw 4. He did have a couple touchdowns the previous 2 games, but 5 for 38 and a touchdown, and then 1 for 2 yards and a touchdown is just not really sustainable in this passing attack. Yeah, it's just you're expecting a lot more than 4 targets in a game where Kyle Pitts is gone. You should see at least 8 for London and design plays.
And the CPAC question, what I always come back to is add more flexes and less bench spots, because that makes leagues the most fun, because you're then pressed with those questions of, do I have to drop Cooper Kupp right now? Do I drop Cordarrelle Patterson right now? Put those decisions on every manager. It just makes fantasy football more fun to sweat out those terrible decisions you might make. Sam, we saw this past week from the Packers running backs that A.J. Dillon outperformed Aaron Jones, at least on the ground, even though Aaron Jones still out-carried him. So what are your thoughts on this backfield moving forward?
I think it's still status quo. I'm not buying into the A.J. Dillon performance. It was just his second game this season with double-digit PPR points. He found the end zone for the first time since week 1. It's truly been, I think, worst case scenario for Dillon this season, with Jones staying healthy and them just not wanting to hand over the reins from a running perspective. He hasn't played on over 50% of the snaps. He's done it just once since week 4, which is not great. He is getting some touches in the red zone. He had 3 high-value touches this past week and just 2 in the previous 2 weeks combined. So I'm holding on to Dillon in the event that something happens to Jones, but I'm not starting him based on his 1 week outlier performance based on what we've seen from him the rest of the season.
I know
I
you
think
have thoughts, Paulsen. Yeah.
Yeah, I think he's startable this week against Chicago because Chicago's so bad. I'm just looking at his game log and his strength of schedule, and it's just if you just look back to week 4 through week 11, he had 6 of 8 were bad matchups. The other 2 were neutral matchups. There's a few weird ones in there, like Detroit's now a red matchup, which just doesn't compute in my brain. But apparently they've been playing pretty good rush defense. Last week against Philly, green matchup, had the good 8 yards per carry. This week's another great matchup against Chicago. He has a bye in week 14, and then the Rams, Miami, and Minnesota, which are all neutral matchups. So I agree that he's not like somebody I want to run out and start. But if they have their running game going, which they did against Philly, both Jones, because he can also contribute as a receiver, and Dillon do have a little bit, at least, Dillon has some flex. Obviously Jones is an RB1, RB2, but Dillon at least is in that flex conversation in good matchups where the Packers can control the line of scrimmage. And he's also, interestingly was used as a receiver against Philly too, 3 catches for 24 yards. So I do think that you mentioned his upside. If anything happens to Jones, absolutely RB1 upside if Jones is injured. But I think, he's probably RB3 flex type. I think this week is a week where you could start him.
And more importantly, Aaron Jones still being used, as you mentioned, in the passing game. And what I noted in the Waiver Wire podcast, the Bears, their last 5 games, 34.5 points per game in that stretch. Also 9.4 yards per attempt. Just an absolute disaster. Sam, you want to discuss the Titans wide receivers because Treylon Burks now has led this wide receiver core in target per route run rate, 25% since he returned in week 10. And what we saw with this past week was him lead Nick Westbrook-Akeen and routes run for the first time since Burke was initially injured in week 4. So we think this usage and on-field opportunity are finally creating a cocktail for us and for Burks to break out. Your thoughts on this team?
Yeah, I'm very bullish on Burks right now for the rest of the season. We've seen his route share rise each of the last several games. So as he's, sort of gotten further removed from that injury, he's getting more ingrained in the offense. He has 20 targets in the last 3 games combined, which is more than the 16 targets that he had in his first 4 games. He's got at least 70 receiving yards in back-to-back games, found the end zone on a definitely not fluky play in the game against the Bengals this last week. But the other thing to note is that with Ryan Tannehill back, which they came back in the same week, the Titans have a negative 0.8% pass rate over expectation, which doesn't sound high. It is negative, but for a team like the Titans, who are typically around -5%, -6%, that is huge. And so I think if the Titans continue, at least stay steady with that pass rate, that Burks can continue to thrive and have a great second half breakout, which we see from rookie receivers all the time.
Tannehill, at least 34 pass attempts in 2 of his last 3 games. And unlike what they did with 360 rushing yards against the Packers, you can't run on the Titans. So this game, I love the over. I've been eyeing this game for DFS for all week long now. But Paulsen, any thoughts on Titans wide receiver room and Treylon Burks rest of season? Also, we have Tannehill in a sneaky spot against the Jaguars in week 14 to be ahead of too, if we're thinking about picking him up this week.
Burks, it's encouraging. He's got 6, 8, and 6 targets the last 3 games, and in a fairly run-heavy offense like the Titans have, that's encouraging. 7 for 111, and then 4 for 70. His numbers look a little inflated because he recovered a touchdown last week on a fumble, so he ended up with 18.1 fantasy points in week 11, 17 in week 12. He feels a little dicey to me just because, Tannehill, yes, he's better than the other options there at quarterback, but he's got 10 touchdowns in 9 games. So I do think there's a possible yardage breakout for Burks, but I just don't have much confidence that he's going to catch a touchdown in any given week. He doesn't have he recovered a touchdown on a fumble before he caught one this year, which is pretty crazy.
2 back-to-back games with at least one 50-yard play are still encouraging. Sam, let's discuss the Chiefs wide receivers, which, like a lot of backfields this week, are touch and go all over the place. Justin Watson has led this team in routes run in back-to-back games, but you wouldn't know it because he's earned just 6 targets in that time. Meanwhile, Sky Moore has run the fewest routes among their wide receivers, ran a lower route rate than even Juju Smith-Schuster, who was used as the team's 3rd wide receiver this past week. But Sky Moore, even though his opportunity continues to dip, he still has earned a target on 32% of his routes the past 2 games, averaging 6 in those contests. So what the hell do we make of this receivers room ahead of a 53-point blow-up spot?
So this is tough because Patrick Mahomes is leading the league in passing yards and passing touchdowns. These receivers can have a blow-up game at any point because of what Mahomes can do, but Moore has hit a season high 42.1% routes per dropback rate in week 11, which was the game that both Juju and Mecole Hardman were out. Justin Watson has more games with a routes run rate above 50% than Moore does. Moore doesn't have any, and Watson has 3. Again, he's gotten 6 targets in each of the last 2 weeks. So that said, I'm comfortable dropping Moore at this point if you still are holding on to him. I think MVS, Marcus Valdes-Scantling, is probably the second best option right now. Again, we don't really know with Kadarius Toney. I think he is not practicing today, but this passing attack behind Travis Kelce is just so unconcentrated. They have 8 players with a target share between 5 and 15%. That's tied for the 6th most in the league. Again, it's tough to sit any of these players because of the spike week potential that they have. But Juju, I think if healthy, you can probably comfortably plug him into your lineup. He hasn't had great touchdown luck, but continues to receive a ton of targets. And Valdes-Scantling, Toney, and Hardman are the only other receivers I'd consider holding on to at this point.
And Juju was only limited Paulsen on Friday before getting clear from the concussion protocol. So I would imagine that played into his 3rd highest route rate on the team last week. Having said that, I still need you to rank them for everyone against the Bengals for week 13. All of them.
Yeah, I was going to mention that. I think that was the ramp-up game for Juju. He'd be the one, other than Kelce, obviously. Juju would be the one that I would start. He had against the Bengals, he had 12 targets in his last healthy game. He was knocked out early in that previous game. The game, obviously he missed a game because of the concussion. Came back and was limited on Friday. I think that was the ramp-up game for him. And then I've got, Valdes-Scantling and Watson and Moore in that order, but I don't feel confident about any of them. So I would feel pretty confident about Juju Smith-Schuster playing 60-70% of the snaps, and I think that's a good spot for him against Cincy, the 21st in adjusted fantasy points allowed to receivers.
My toxic trait is also keeping Kadarius Toney rostered, even though he's going to have a hamstring injury every day through the 2022 season. Paulsen, lots of touch and go. So I think it's just easiest to sign off and saying, make sure you are locked into 4for4.com this week for both our podcast and articles for the rest of the week. But any other thoughts you want to leave everyone ahead of week 13?
Yeah, we'll be, watching these injuries all week. The podcast is back on Friday with Anthony. So we'll discuss all these situations then. But just I'll keep the rankings as updated as I can, given all these injuries and injury statuses. A lot of running back injuries, especially to deal with.
Sam, I heard that the best Hoppen conclusions of week 13 was written.
It was. Not only was it written, it was posted this morning. We've already got thousands of sponsorship opportunities because of the article, but that is out now. The breakout article will be back tomorrow as well, and then charts over on Twitter.
As Paulsen said, make sure you tune into that Friday show with him and Anthony, because we will have a clear view of injury reports at that time. Waiver wire column also updated for potential playoff matchups and stashes, and will be updated again as you're listening to this Wednesday afternoon for everyone, since playoffs are right here for a lot of people. So until then, you know where to find us. We'll be back. And remember, be a little bit kinder than what's required. We'll see you next time.